Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It was the day after the Muslims were victorious at the Battle of Uhud, in the month of Shawwal, in the third year after Hijrah. The Mushrikeen had fled and the Muslims were returning home too. The Shuhada had been buried. The injured Sahaba had received emergency treatment, and the army had left Uhud and were heading home to Medina. The battle was over for the Mushrikeen, but it was never really over. So before the kuffar of the Quraysh reached Makkah, Hazrat Abu Sufyan radiyallahu anhu stopped the army and they set up camp outside of the city. The thought that was going through the heads of the kuffar was that the Muslims had suffered losses on Uhud. And what's more is that there were many Sahaba radiyallahu anhum that were injured as well. So they figured that the Muslims were in a weak state and that if they struck now, then they could get rid of the Muslims once and for all. But the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum were truly people of Iman. And things like dying for the sake of Allah was something that they looked forward to and strove towards. It wasn't something that they shied or ran away from. During that night, after arriving in Medina, the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum began receiving treatment for their numerous injuries. As many of them were seriously injured, and some tribes such as Banu Abdul Ashhal, everyone in the tribe was injured. The night was spent in this manner. And then after Fajr the next morning, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam asked Hazrat Bilal radiyallahu anhu to make an announcement saying that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is commanding you to pursue your enemies, the mushrikeen of Makkah, but only those who had partaken in Uhud were permitted to come with. The reaction and the response of the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum is what made them Sahaba and what wrote their names in gold on the palaces of Jannah. Hazrat Bilal radiyallahu anhu made the announcement, and the other senior Sahaba radiyallahu anhum relayed the message to those who hadn't heard it. Hazrat Usayd ibn Hudayr radiyallahu anhu had 7 injuries from the Battle of Uhud, and he was sitting down about to treat it when Hazrat Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh radiyallahu anhu arrived at his door to inform him of the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Hazrat Usayd radiyallahu anhu put down his medicine, picked up his weapons and said, Sam'an wa ta'atan lillahi wa rasulih. We hear and we obey Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And so he went out in that injured state without even treating his injuries. Hazrat Sa'ad ibn Ubadah radiyallahu anhu relayed the message to his tribe, Banu Sa'ida, who were busy treating their injuries, and immediately they got themselves ready and set out. Hazrat Abu Qatada radiyallahu anhu went to inform some of the other injured Sahaba radiyallahu anhum of the message of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So they jumped up from their sick beds, grabbed their weapons and headed out. Just from the tribe of Banu Salimah alone, 40 injured Sahaba radiyallahu anhum set out. Amongst these Sahaba was Hazrat Tufail ibn Nu'man radiyallahu anhu. He had 13 injuries. Hazrat Khirash ibn Simma radiyallahu anhu, he had 10 wounds. Hazrat Ka'ab ibn Malik radiyallahu anhu had more than 10. Hazrat Qutbah ibn Amir radiyallahu anhu had 9 injuries. And we're not talking about having hangnails and paper cuts here. We're talking about Sahaba radiyallahu anhum that were shot with arrows, stabbed with spears and cut with swords. Some had lost limbs, and others' limbs were paralyzed. It is with injuries of this extent that the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum got up and went out to fight in another battle for the sake of Allah. And today, people ask if they can make tayammum because the water in the tap is a little cold, and they're too lazy to heat it up. And then we wonder, how come things are so different today to how it was back then? In this state, the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum gathered at the well of Abu Ainaba and arranged themselves in rows, waiting for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And with this gathering of Sahaba radiyallahu anhum all present, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam saw their state and made special dua for the tribe of Banu Salima. 2 brothers, Hazrat Abdullah ibn Sahal and Hazrat Rafi' ibn Sahal radiyallahu anhuma, were from the tribe of Banu Abdul Ashhal. They had suffered many injuries, so many injuries that they could not even walk, and they did not have mounts to carry them. So they crawled from their homes to join up with Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. But Hazrat Rafi' radiyallahu anhu was so weak from his injuries that even crawling was difficult. So his brother Hazrat Abdullah radiyallahu anhu, who himself was injured and crawling, took turns carrying his brother on his back as he crawled to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Hazrat Nusayba binti Ka'b radiyallahu anha, she was a woman, but a woman that is worth more than all of the men of the world today combined. She had sustained many injuries defending Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the worst of which was a deep gash in her shoulder where she was struck with a sword. The blow she suffered would probably have taken another person's arm off, and this wound alone took an entire year to heal. Hazrat Talha radiyallahu anhu, covered in wounds, rushed with such haste to join the army of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he even forgot that he was injured. Only one Sahabi that wasn't part of Uhud was allowed to join. Hazrat Jabir ibn Abdullah radiyallahu anhuma, as his father had instructed him to look after his sisters that were all small and there was no one else to see to them. His father, Hazrat Abdullah ibn Jabir radiyallahu anhu, was chosen by Allah to be one of the shuhada of Uhud. He was such a great Sahabi and so beloved to Allah that Allah granted him a ni'mah which no non-Nabi had ever received. Allah spoke to him directly in Jannah without any intermediary. So when his son Hazrat Jabir ibn Abdullah radiyallahu anhuma asked for permission to join the army, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam accepted and he went with. The head of the Munafiqeen, Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, then turned up asking for permission as well to join the army. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told him to stay, him and his Munafiqeen that had abandoned the Muslims at Uhud, and all of them were forced to remain behind. So the Muslims set out, injured as they were, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had multiple injuries too. The beloved Rasul of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's Mubarak head had a gash. The cheek of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was cut from the helmet that had broken. The incisor of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had broken off from the same injury. The inner part of the bottom lip of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was injured. Not only that, but the right shoulder of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was lame, and both knees of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was injured. In this state, Khairul Bariya alayhi salatu wasalam, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam set out in jihad to face the kuffar. And so the Muslims went out and camped at a place known as Hamraa'ul Asad, and this is where the battle got its name from. When the Muslims arrived at Hamraa'ul Asad, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam ordered the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum to gather firewood. So they gathered whatever they could, and when night came, then everyone lit their own fire. So 500 torches lit up the night, making the Muslim army look much larger than what it was in reality. A man who belonged to a tribe that had a peace treaty with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and good feelings with the Muslims met up with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was not yet a Muslim at this point in time. His name was Hazrat Mus'ab al-Khuza'i radiyallahu anhu. He then went off and met up with Hazrat Abu Sufyan radiyallahu anhu and the mushrikeen of Quraysh, telling him and them that they didn't harm the Muslims at Uhud, that the Muslims have only grown in strength, and this news made the mushrikeen afraid, and they chose to flee back to Makkah rather than suffer a second defeat at the hands of the Muslims. Hazrat Mus'ab radiyallahu anhu then sent a man to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, informing Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that the mushrikeen had fled, running back to Makkah, and that the threat of the kuffar had been neutralized. If ever there was a display of submission, obedience and sacrifice to Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then it is the events which transpired with the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum at Ghazwat Hamraa'ul Asad. So the Muslims returned to Medina, and in this way, the Battle of Hamraa'ul Asad came to an end. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.